Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Data Architecture Virtual Chapter of PASS. Today, I have Tim Mitchell presenting. He's going to be talking, are there ticking time bombs in your SSIS package? I want to thank Kenny Neal for always helping me. He's a virtual co-leader. And if y'all have any questions, you can reach out to me at rob@sqltigers.com, or you can email us or go to our website at dataarchitecture.pass.org. So the next meetings, Kimberly will be coming on and Kevin Klein. If you haven't signed up, please sign up. That'll be great. So we really want to thank Nutanix. For the past 2 years, they've been our sponsor. They've been great. They give us resources to have the webinars. Please click on, go to this link and check them out. Thank you, Nutanix. If you're going to Summit, here's a code that'll save you a lot of money. It'll save you $150. So it's coming up, end of the month. So VC15FFM6, use that, save you $150. So community nights, they have a bunch of events. So if you're going to PASS Summit, these are some events they have. They have a game night, a karaoke night, after work party from Idera, and also Women in Technology happy hour event. So you may want to check it out. PASS wants to tell everyone who won the elections. So here's the winners. You got John, you got Chris, Diego. Congratulations on winning the seats. Upcoming meetings. So let's see. There's a bunch going on. If you want to check out like high availability or administrations, tons of great meetings. Just log on to sqlpass.org and check it out. Here's a few more coming up. PASS has lots of virtual chapters, so if you have time, and it might be another area you want to check out, like big data or database administration, and they always having webinars that are free, no cost. So check it out if you have some time. Upcoming SQL Saturdays. So if you're in the area of Orlando or Kansas City, Charlotte, or Oregon, etc., or even out of the country, it's amazing. Free SQL Saturdays. Lots of free training. And you can connect with PASS on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. Here are the links. So with that, I want to thank Tim again. Tim, are you there?
I am.
Great. I'm going to change it over to you. Thank you again for coming on today.
My pleasure. So I'll show my screen. Rob, if you could let me know if you can see that okay?
Yeah, so I can see your screen and I hear you great. So this is two great things going on.
All right, perfect. Well, everyone, I appreciate you taking the time to join me for this presentation. We're going to be talking about, like Rob said, integration services, and specifically I'm going to go over a few time bombs that you want to look for. What I mean by that is if there are things in your integration services packages that maybe they're running okay right now, or you haven't discovered any issues related to performance or logic or anything like that, there are some cases, and not just SSIS, but any ETL tool, where you could have a hidden danger built into your logic. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those specifically around integration services. So by way of agenda, we'll quickly go through an overview. Got a list of the different problem domains or the types of performance problems or time bombs that could be hidden in there. I've got a handful of demos as well. I've also left some time at the end for questions. So we've got an hour scheduled. I don't think we'll need the entire hour, so we'll definitely have some time for questions on the other side of the presentation. So a little bit about me, if you don't know who I am, my name is Tim Mitchell. I'm a BI consultant. I'm based out of the Dallas, Texas area. I'm principal and founder of a company called Tyler's Data Solutions, where we specialize in data warehousing, ETL, analytics, and things that touch those disciplines. I've been a Microsoft MVP for coming on 8 years now, I guess. And if you want to follow along with some of the things that I do, I blog over at timmitchell.net. And if you're on Twitter, you can follow me at tim_Mitchell. So we'll talk a little bit about, just by way of overview, the types of things that you can do in integration services. For those of you who do work in integration services, you know this to be true. Even if you've never really worked a lot with integration services, it's pretty easy for someone to pick up integration services for the first time ever and really start developing packages pretty quickly. Now, that doesn't make them an expert. It doesn't mean that it's easy to do anything in integration services. But if you need to do some simple things, I need to get data from a flat file, pardon me, into a SQL Server database. I need to move data from one SQL Server instance to another, or from the cloud to on-prem, or something like that. Walking through the UI and integration services, Microsoft did a really good job of making it fairly intuitive for someone to figure out how to move data from A to B. And in fact, if you use the tools like there's I forget the name of the tool in Management Studio, but there's a data import, or I think it's a data import export wizard is the name of the tool. If you've ever used that tool, you've already done some SSIS-like operations. So a lot of those are very intuitive. I like to tell people that most anyone can build a basic integration services package. And that's true, because you can figure out, if you know a little bit about data, you know a little bit about how to write a query and how to get a list of tables and figure out what table you want to get data from and to, you can do it. However, it's not that easy to build well-designed integration services packages. And if you're indulging in that without a lot of knowledge over what happens behind the scenes, or some of the devil's in the details, if you will, if you don't know about those types of things, it can come back to bite you later on. So the types of things that you want to watch out for, any ETL tool, and SSIS in particular, does have the ability to lose data without any warning or any error whatsoever. Ideally, you would have, if you're losing data, if there's some leaky part of your SSIS package or ETL process in general, where if you're bringing in n number of rows in from a source, and you're loading out n-1 number of rows to some other destination, you might think that there'd be a warning or an error, or text would flash, or alarms would go off or something, and that's simply not the case. There are lots of places in integration services where you can fairly easily lose data, and you'll get no warning and no error whatsoever. So things like, we'll look at a couple of these in when we get into the demos, but things like the lookup transformation. If you've ever used the lookup transformation, and most everybody who's used integration services has probably used the lookup, it's fairly easy to configure the lookup transformation where you will lose data if you have a failed lookup and you're not capturing your failed lookup, or the rows that actually failed to find a match in that lookup. That's by design, at least the fact that you can lose that data, because it's, in many cases, you do want that data to fall off. Think about a case where if you're loading, so for those of you who work in data warehousing, if you're loading a dimension table and you only want to load new rows, or rows that haven't previously been loaded to that dimension table, you might use a lookup transformation. And if that lookup value is not found, go ahead and load it into the table. But if it is found, you just want to discard that data. There are cases where that's a valid approach. But what you want to watch out for is getting yourself into a situation where you think all the data is being loaded from source to destination, but it's being silently dropped off and there's no warning and no error whatsoever. So that's one of the potential time bombs in there, is just simply losing data and having no record of it whatsoever. Things like logical errors. SSIS is a really good tool. It's a really flexible tool, and that flexibility also allows you to paint yourself in the corner, virtually speaking, on possibly introducing logical errors in your ETL processes. So things as simple as your control flow precedence constraints. You can use on your control flow, you can use those precedence constraints to determine which tasks execute in which order. I want this task to execute first, followed by that one. But if the first one fails, I want to execute some other task to do cleanup or notify someone about that. all those logic pieces are very good, but it's fairly easy to build in logical errors in there. And the frightening thing is that integration services won't, on the control flow side, it won't give you any sort of a warning if you create unreachable tasks, or if you create some sort of logical control flow issue where you can never reach a certain task. The same is true over on the data flow side. So this is one of the more common data quality issues that I deal with, is if you're doing a lot of transformations in the data flow, you want to make absolutely sure that the transformation is doing what you expect and that it's touching the rows that you actually want to update. So there might be a case where if you've got, say, fact data and dimension data coming from the same source, or you've got clean data and dirty data, or old data and new data, you might want to handle those differently in your data flow, but passing those through the same transformations could lead to some issues if you're just handling everything with a broadsword approach. Same type of thing if you're doing any sort of manipulation of the data along the wire, doing typecasts, doing string manipulation, especially if the possibility exists that you could truncate data in integration services. You definitely want to watch out for that, because those are the types of things that you don't really see that there's a problem, because it may not error out at all. If syntactically you've got your transformations configured right, but the logic is wrong, you're really not going to find out about that until you do a data audit, or until a user starts to complain. And more often than not, it's the latter. It's a user actually complaining, hey, the data is wrong. This is not what we're expecting. What's going on there? Another problem domain and things to watch out for as far as time bombs in your SSIS processes is performance issues. I deal a lot with integration services performance, and one of the things that I see is you develop a package, it works well in testing and isolation. So you've got a small set of test data, maybe on your machine, on your virtual machine, that you're using for testing, and everything works fine whenever you're testing or you're running through your paces on that set of data. The minute you push it out to production, the thing completely blows up. That's a fairly common problem. Another type of problem is maybe it works well on your machine and it works well when you push it over to production. It actually starts doing its thing well once you get it up to the server. But as time goes along, as the volume of data increases, as it tends to do, the process gets slower and slower, because some of what you've built into your SSIS package is not built well for performance. Integration services, I mentioned earlier, it's a very flexible tool, and it will let you do frankly, it'll let you do some dumb things, because there are some cases where doing a particular thing on a set of data that it's known to be small and will always be small is the right way to go. But if you're getting up into larger sets of data, doing that type of thing really doesn't work well. The standout example that comes to my mind is the slowly changing dimension wizard. So for those of you who have used the SCD wizard before, you know this is true, that the SCD wizard is great for starting out, especially for someone who's first getting started with slowly changing dimensions. Maybe they don't think through, these are all the things that I need to do to manage a slowly changing dimension or a historical table of any type. So using the slowly changing dimension wizard can help walk through that. It is a wizard, like the name implies, so it'll walk you through all the pieces that you need to do, and it creates all the destinations and the update statements for you. The problem with tools like that is that while they do work well on very small sets of data, they simply don't scale well. They're designed to be used for those cases where you've got hundreds, maybe the low thousands of rows of data. But if you get into tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of rows of data, performance is not going to scale well. In fact, it's not going to scale in relation to the amount of data that you're processing. So if you process twice as much data, it's not going to take twice as much time. Because tools like that go on a row-by-row basis, or they're handling things on a row-by-row basis, it's going to scale exponentially. So if you double the amount of data that you're processing, it might take 10 or 20 times more processing time to be able to process that, because you're not doing bulk sets of data, you're doing row by row by row. So you want to watch out for things like that. Again, just because it works well on your machine doesn't mean it's going to work well when you get to the server, because the volume of data might be different. And over time, even on the server, your volume of data is going to grow. So make sure that you're watching out for those types of issues. So another problem domain is security, and specifically around using passwords to connect to sources and destinations and integration services. If you're only dealing with SQL Server sources and destinations, this probably won't be much of an issue for you. But most ETL systems will connect to some foreign set of data. So you're getting data from FTP, secure FTP, you're reaching out to an Oracle server or a DB2 server, and something is going to require, a password to pass in. One of the things that you'll find on integration services is that an individual package, if you're working with something with a password, and you as the SSIS developer go and type in that password, and you close the package, if you reopen it, by default, you don't have to type that connection password in again. It's going to remember that password for you and your login. But if you share that package with someone else, they try to open it up, that password is encrypted for you and you alone by default in that package. So if somebody else opens up the same package that was working for you, it's not going to work for them, and they're going to see a cryptic error, something along the lines of can't decrypt XML node, because it's trying to decrypt that password that was encrypted for your login and yours alone. So I've answered a lot of questions from clients and on forums about that very thing. Package, it worked well on my machine when I'm developing it, but when I shared it with another SSIS developer, they had to enter in all the passwords or it just wouldn't work at all. That's the reason for that, because it's encrypting those assets with your login. The same type of thing will occur when you deploy your package to the server. So if you're pushing your package out to the server, you've got an Oracle connection with a password or a DB2 connection with a password. You can't assume that, first of all, you can't assume that that password is going to be stored in the SSIS package. But once you move the package up to the server, whether you're executing from MSDB or from the SSIS catalog, you're using a different set of credentials. So just because it works on your machine while it's using your login, it doesn't mean that it's going to run okay from the server. So you have to pay attention to not just how those passwords and other sensitive pieces of information are being stored, but what permissions or what service account is being used to execute that package, and what permissions does that account have, because that's really the determining factor in whether or not that package will run once you move it from your machine to somewhere else. All right, so that's the end of our slide deck, so we'll jump in. I'll show you a few demos that we've got. So the first one that I'm going to show you is using a lookup transformation, and I'll show you how easy it is in integration services to lose data using the lookup transform. So I've got an execute SQL task that's just truncating my staging table. I've got a data flow that's doing a load from a source, doing a lookup and passing the data into a destination table once it does the lookup. Let me move this around a little bit so you can see it all on one screen. All right, so I'm grabbing my sales data from my OLTP system or my transaction processing system. I want to make sure that we've got a valid salesperson. And for those that do have a valid salesperson, we're going to go ahead and load those into my sales output table. The lookup transformation, I've changed one thing from the default. So everything else here is the same. So it's typically using full cache mode. You're going to be using the OLADB connection manager. The thing that I've overridden on this, and this is actually the most common setting for the lookup transformation, is to redirect rows to the no match output. So if you're doing a lookup, for example, on salesperson, as we are now, and you don't want that to fail, the default setting is for it to fail if it doesn't find a lookup. That's occasionally the right way to go, but more often than not, you actually want that to redirect to no match output. Perhaps a redirect to an error output in some cases. So I've overridden that to the more common case here. So this package is going to succeed. Let me go back to the control flow. I'm going to execute that package. I don't expect any errors or any warnings from this package. So if I go over to the progress window, let's see. So with my resolution, it smashes up the text a little bit, but just scrolling through here, we don't see any errors or any warnings whatsoever. Package ran in just a shade over 1 second. So this was a success, or was it? So if I look If I look back over here, so I've got 3,806 rows coming in. For some reason, so this is actually not what it was supposed to do. There's a lookup transform on here it's actually supposed to lose some of the data. So that's actually a little flubbed up. Bear with me for just one quick second. I'll try for about 10 seconds to get this fixed, and if I can't, we'll just move on. Try that real quick. And re-execute that. All right, so this is a good example of that. So the package was successful. Once again, if we go back and look at the progress window, we're going to have no errors and no warnings whatsoever. However, what we see down here is that I had 3,800 rows that were coming through. They were passed into the lookup transform, but because I changed that to redirect the rows to no match output to simply go out to a different output, and I'm not capturing that output, I've got no rows of data going over to my match output because nothing was returned by that lookup query. Again, no errors, no warnings whatsoever. So if I look in my log in the SSIS execution, either on MSDB or on the SSIS catalog, this package will show that it was successful even though it didn't load any data. This might be the way that you want that to work, where if it doesn't match anything, those rows just die. But as kind of an ETL purist, this type of scenario makes me nervous because we're purposefully losing data, or maybe not purposefully. We are certainly losing data on the data flow, and there's really no audit trail to show this data it's being sent to triage or any sort of log to say we're losing this data on purpose. But this is the setting if you're using the lookup transformation and you save that no match setting to either redirect to no match output or redirect to the error output. It's not going to give you any warning or any error whatsoever. So this is a potential way that data could be lost in integration services. Now, a workaround for that is if you're using the lookup transformation, make sure that you're doing something like this. And this is pretty much the minimally viable product, or the smallest amount of work that you would want to do. Ideally, you're going to send this out to a triage table or something similar. But what we're doing here is going to run that again, and I suspect that query is going to do the same thing that it did before. For some reason, my lookup query, it was configured to work where it would lose data. For some reason, it's not anymore. But the concept still remains here, where I've got a certain number of rows coming through. In this case, all the rows went to the match output. But in the case where I don't have, or I've got some that fell out for some reason, they couldn't find a lookup value or something along those lines, those are sent over to a row count transformation. Now, in this case, we're not doing anything with that data, but that may be okay. If this is a case where if I've got some dirty data, this is coming in from, maybe it's emails that I collected from a trade show, and I want to validate that it's a validly formatted email address. And if it falls out of that valid formatting, I just simply want to throw it away. It doesn't have business value. That might be a case to do this. I prefer actually putting that into a triage table, because if the auditor comes calling and says, hey, you've been missing 5 rows of data for every day for the last year, where has that data been going? At least you have an audit trail to show this is where that data resides. But even better, there might be a case where if you're bringing that data in, even if it doesn't make it down to the main table that you want to load to, there might be some business value in storing that in the triage table, some residual benefit that you can harvest from that. So if you're doing something like this, consider using a triage table and loading that up. But at a minimum, you want to make sure that you know that lookup transformation, if you've got it configured to redirect, which is the most common configuration, it can lose data. And in the execution results or in the output log, it's not going to show you any warnings or any errors when that occurs. All right, we're going to stick on the lookup transformation for just a second. And I'm going to show you an example of one of these things that you might not expect to see. So pulling in some data from a flat file source, I'm doing a lookup transformation. I'm matching up, again, using the redirect to no match output. And on my connection, I'm going to query my person table, and I want to get the first name and last name, and I'm going to match up for that incoming data. In my incoming data, I've got first name and last name field. I've also got first name and last name in the lookup table that or the lookup query that I'm referencing. And I'm going to try to match that up. This one I'm doing properly, where I'm sending my match over here. So if it does find a match on first name, last name, it goes down here. If it doesn't find a match, it goes over to the right. And I've also got I've got a data viewer on here, so I can see very quickly when I'm running the package in Visual Studio that the rows that have fallen out. And I did that purposefully because I want you to see some of that data that's coming through. So this is I like to say this is a bug and not a feature of Visual Studio. Occasionally, especially 2015, seems a little prone to crashing on Windows 8, which I'm still running a Windows 8. So let's let that restart. Bear with me just a second. While that does, I'm going to open up. So you get a troubleshooting lesson here as well. Occasionally, if Visual Studio crashes in the middle of a package execution, it will leave a residual execution of SSIS debug host. And in this case, I've got two of them actually. I've got one 64-bit and one 32-bit. So we're going to manually kill that SSIS debug host. We're going to crank this back up and try that package again. Sorry about that. So that was our lookup case sensitivity. We'll fire that up again. So again, we're bringing in flat file data. We're looking that up based on first name and last name, and then we're sending the matched lookup separate to a different output from the no match, or where it didn't find a match there. So we'll go ahead and run that. We should see a data viewer for the no match side of things. And here's a list. I've actually got quite a few that didn't find a match. This is the first name, last name combination for each one of those. So I want to do some investigation. So it looks like Mary Dempsey is one of the people that we didn't find a match for. I'm going to jump over here and query that same table that we were using and see, do we have where first name equals Mary and last name equals Dempsey. So in spite of what my SSIS package is telling me, I do in fact have a Mary Dempsey here. However, there's a small nuanced difference that you'll probably see here. Mary Dempsey that I just typed in is lowercase, so and this is the way it appears in the database as well. So Mary Dempsey with uppercase first letter is how it appears here. However, using my no match output data viewer, this is showing it's all in uppercase. Now my database is in case insensitive collation, meaning that this capital M-A-R-Y is exactly the same as far as the string representation as capital M lowercase a-r-y. Doesn't make any difference. However, when you bring that into the SSIS data flow and you use the lookup transformation to look up that data, if you're using full cache lookup mode, which is what we're doing here, it will always do a case-sensitive comparison. Even if your database has case-insensitive collation, it will do a full case-sensitive comparison. So because we didn't have a Mary Dempsey uppercase in all letters in our database, it's going to fail that and show that no match was found because it's doing a full case-sensitive lookup. There is no setting on the lookup transformation to force it to do a case-insensitive lookup. Really, the only way that you can implicitly do that is if you go all the way down here and use no cache and set that to use no cache instead of full or partial cache. It will do a case-insensitive lookup. The downside to that is it's going to look up every single row against the database. So if you've got 10,000 rows or 100,000 rows of data, it's going to do 10 or 100,000 queries, individual queries against that lookup table. So you want to avoid that. So in all practicality, there's really no way, there's no native setting in the lookup transformation to force that to use case insensitivity. However, there is a little bit of a design pattern workaround that you can do. You probably already guessed what we're going to do here. Instead of assuming that that we're just going to use the native case, I'm going to make everything the same. So in this case, I'm pulling in from the same file, using the same lookup, the same two outputs that we had earlier. I'm using an intermediate step here. Instead of using the native first and last names, I'm using uppercase first name and uppercase last name for that comparison. I'll pass that into the lookup transformation. And over on my connection, instead of just pulling first name and last name from the database, I'm pulling uppercase first name and uppercase last name. So I'm comparing apples to apples rather than assuming that the case is always going to be the same. And when I run that, we're going to see a very different set of results. So previously we had lots of rows going over to the no match output, and now we've only got 3. The vast majority, 1,048 of the total 1,051, actually did find a match, and there's only a small handful that didn't find a match. That's a little bit of extra work, but if you're using your lookup transformation to compare text data, and there's any chance that there could be case sensitivity issues, you'll almost certainly have to do something like this, because it will do, when it's doing full cache lookup, or even in partial cache, if it's doing the subsequent lookups, it will do a case sensitive lookup on text-based, on character-based data. So do be aware of that. That's one of those little logic bombs that that it'll present itself at some point down the road, but it doesn't really manifest itself as an error. It's really going to show up whenever somebody complains and says, "Hey, we're trying to find this Mary person. She should have been in the data. She should have been in the valid lookup table, but for whatever reason, she's not coming through." So do be aware that that's how that lookup transformation works. So you can have the same type of thing that would go on in the MergeJoin transformation. I don't see a lot of folks using the MergeJoin. I don't use this a whole lot, but it is really handy for a few scenarios. Specifically, if you need to do some sort of an inner join or a left join operation directly in your data flow. This is especially good if you're bringing together disparate sets of data like we're doing in this case. I want to join together a file-based list of salespeople with a relational database list of sales records, and I'm going to bring those together using the MergeJoin transformation. The way the MergeJoin works is that just like a left join, right join, or an inner join, it's going to bring two sets of data together and let you specify the columns from that union or from that join that you want to include. And you specify in the MergeJoin the columns that you want to join on. So in this case, we're using the salesperson ID from the file to join the salesperson. It's off the bottom of the screen, but it's using the salesperson ID from that relational set of data to do that join. And then I'll specify by checking the check boxes over here which of those columns I want to include. In this case, I'm not including any of the salesperson ID. I'm just doing this for validation purposes. But one of the, we can call it a quirk, I suppose. It's by design. One of the ways that the MergeJoin behaves is that it expects both left and right inputs to be sorted. So for whatever column you're joining on, in this case it's the salesperson ID, we have to have that data joined in the source. So to do that, I'm using the sort transformation. And this is from the flat file source. So I'm sorting on salesperson ID, which is the column that we're using. Now, instead of doing that over here, I'm going to sort in the database engine. But to do that on this side of it, I actually have to go into the advanced editor, go into input and output properties, and I'm going to tell this output that the query is actually sorted by setting is sorted to true, and then for each of the column or columns that I want to sort by, actually it'll be on the output columns. So on the sort key position, you can see that I didn't, on this one, I haven't specified the sort key position. So I've got this one configured improperly. I don't see any warnings. I don't see any errors on here. So let's see if we're going to have, if we're going to get the output that we expect on here. So bringing in salespeople data from the left, sales records from the right, and the result of that join, I'm only getting 8 rows of data coming out of here. That's definitely not what I want to see out of this thing, because For this case, what I want to do is I want those to join together, and I need to see, I should see for every sales record, I should see that join with the appropriate salesperson. 3,800 records shouldn't yield an output of 8 records. What I'm doing wrong here is, so I had that sort key position that wasn't properly set up, but the bigger issue that I'm dealing with is I'm telling integration services that that data is sorted. However, there is no order by clause on here. This data is in fact not sorted, and it's just going to fall out in whatever random order that comes out of the table. The way the merge join works is that it will buffer up the data, so it will hold up if you're doing an alpha sort, or you're joining on alphanumeric columns, for example. It's going to bring in all the A's from the left and the right side, followed by the B's from the left and the right side, and so on. And that's why it expects that for performance purposes to be sorted. But the downside to that is if I bring in data that is not sorted, if it comes in out of order, I'm going to end up losing that data because it assumes that everything is sorted. It goes from A to Z or from 0 to 9 or whatever the order is. And if it finds something out of order, it's not going to go back and try to reprocess that. So that's why this is occurring, is because I've got those, even though it expects that to be sorted, I've told it it's sorted, but I'm not really sorting that information. So the way it ought to work is, let me slide this back up here. My virtual machine always shrinks down the resolution whenever I show this on the small screen, so bear with me. Same exact setup that we had before. The only difference that I'm doing here is that I properly got that sort key position specified. And now I'm correctly ordering by the salesperson ID. So this data will be sorted when it comes out of here, sorted by salesperson ID, which is the key on which we're joining in that merge join. And if I scroll down, I've got salesperson ID set up here. Look in the advanced editor. I think I showed you the wrong column just a second ago on that output, but I'll show you what it should look like. Go down to salesperson ID. So here's sort key position, and this doesn't automatically happen. If I use an order by clause in my query, this will not automatically happen. I have to go in and tell it the data is sorted, and it's sorted by this column or columns. So in doing so, running the same logic that we had before, the only difference is I am properly specifying that order by clause. Now we actually get 3,806 rows that are coming through because each one of those properly matched up with the salesperson to which it belonged. Again, this is the merge join behaving by design. We could probably argue that it shouldn't work like that, or if it encounters unsorted data, there ought to be an error or at least a warning that would come out. But do be aware that if you're using the merge join transformation and you're using a relational source like we are here to sort the data in the relational source, do be aware that that data absolutely must be sorted. Don't tell it it's sorted and then forget to sort the data. Make sure that you are in fact sorting that data whenever you introduce that into your data flow. All right, let's talk a little bit about performance. So one of the things that I see mistakenly used from time to time is the OLEDB command. So OLEDB, there's quite a few tools in integration services to let you use the OLEDB provider. There's OLEDB source, OLEDB destination. There's also OLEDB command. This can be used like a destination. In most cases, it's a terrible destination to use because the OLEDB command works on a row by row basis. So it's going to update, if you process 10,000 rows of data through your data flow, the OLEDB command will execute the command that you specify, and that's set up. Let me widen this out just a bit and show you the whole thing. The command that we specify in the SQL command property, this will be executed not one time for the whole data set. It'll be executed one time once for every row of data that we're processing. So if you're processing 1 million rows of data, you're going to run 1 million single row update statements. So that's something you need to watch out for. It's deceptively hidden in your other OLEDB tools, but when you use it, especially for any sort of a sizable set of data, it might work well on a small set of data. So right now we've got fewer than 100,000 rows of data that we're processing through here. That ought to zip pretty quickly through. All we're doing is pulling in from a source, using a derived column transformation, and then doing an update based on that. But you can see that it's hung on 9,972. Now what's happening here is it's not really processing 9,972 rows of data. The reason it's stuck on that number is the buffer size is usually about 10,000 rows of data. This one, it sized it down a little bit less, so there's 9,972 rows per buffer in SSIS. Right now, the OLEDB command, if we were to open up Profiler or use extended events, we're going to see update, 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 one for every row of data that we're processing in that table. So let's go ahead and stop that. That would run for a little while. I let this run a little bit in prep last night, and this ran for 4 or 5 minutes before it actually did all of its row by row operations. So I'm going to stop that, and I'm going to show you a better design. This one takes a little bit more setup, but this is a much better performing design pattern. So rather than doing that live update using the OLEDB command, what I recommend is using a staging pattern where you take that same data, rather on the data flow. So I've got a staging table. We're truncating that at the outset of this operation. And then over on my data flow, instead of using the OLEDB command, I'm now using the OLEDB destination. The difference here is the table that I'm writing to, it's not the final table that we're actually going to land the data in. This is just a staging table, and its only purpose is to allow us to temporarily store that data for staging purposes so we can separately run that update operation. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Same, the size of the source data is exactly the same. I didn't even finish my sentence, and this part of the package was done. Go over to the control flow, excuse me, and that's all done. So it's still running the staged update. More than likely, I don't have an index on the stage table. That's okay. But even when we let that run to fruition, doing that update that it's doing, it's going to be a whole lot faster than doing that row by row operation. So the other one, I think we let it run for close to a minute. This one ran for 24 seconds, even on unindexed tables. That's still going to run significantly faster. And if you consider putting an index on there, or especially consider if you've got a much larger volume of data, you don't want integration services to have to handle that on a row by row basis. You want it to be as buffered as possible. Do as much as you can in buffer by buffer or bulk operations rather than row by row operations. All right, one other thing on performance that I'll show you is we mentioned the sort transformation in the last demo, or the one before that one. Using that sort transformation, it's very handy to do. However, there are places where using that sort transformation just doesn't make sense. Sort transformation is a fully blocking transformation, meaning that, while I explain that, I'm going to go ahead and let this run. To be able to sort the data, the sort transformation has to queue up, or it has to buffer up all the rows that it's processing. It can't sort all the data until it has all the data. So you're going to see every row of data that you're dealing with, whether it's 4 rows or 4 million rows or 400 million rows, try to queue up in the SSIS data flow. So you can see we're building all this up. We haven't yet loaded anything into our destination table. It's got to queue up all 4 some odd million rows of this data before it sends out a single row of data. Now, there are cases where using tools like the sort transformation in the data flow are appropriate. Obviously, if you're using text data, you can't write a query to sort text data very easily. So you're going to have to do that sort in most cases in the SSIS data flow like this, rather than in the database engine. But there's really no excuse for what I'm doing here, because I'm running a query from a SQL, from really any relational database. So I'm running it from my SQL Server database here. I'm not using any sort indicator whatsoever. So it's going to let the SSIS data flow do all that sort operation for me. There are things that SSIS does better than the database engine. There are things that the database engine does better than integration services. Sorting is one of those things that the database engine will almost always be better at than integration services. And this is one of those, the reason I group this under the time bomb category is this issue might not manifest itself initially, but the more data you have, the longer it's going to take to do that sort. And it's not something that scales, it doesn't scale in a similar way to doing a sort operation on the database engine. It's going to be a lot slower the more data that you get. So altogether that ran for about 75 seconds, or a minute and 15 seconds. I'm going to do the same thing over here in the database engine. So same exact setup that we had before. I removed that sort transformation. The difference that I'm doing here is I'm sorting by those two columns that we were previously using the sort transformation to sort by. Not only does this let the database engine do what it does well, but this is gonna, oh, for crying out loud, Visual Studio is killing me. All right, I think we still have an empty copy over here. Bear with me just a second. So when we run that, we're letting the database engine do what it does well. So rather than trying to assign that to integration services and let it do that sort operation, which it can do, I'm going to pass control of that off to the database engine. I promise you, for any sizable set of data, integration services will not perform as well in sort operations as the database engine will. That's certainly true of SQL Server. I'd be willing to make small bets that most any relational database system, yes, even Oracle, will perform better than integration services in doing sort operations. Just because that's really, it's an operation more natively designed for a database engine than it was for integration services because of the way SSIS manages the memory. So since Visual Studio is giving us grief, I'm not going to try to rerun that. Suffice it to say that in every test that I've run that, doing the sort in the database engine has significantly outperformed the SSIS data flow counterpart. Again, it'll probably work on small sets of data, but this is something that will at some point bite you down the road because it doesn't scale well as your data grows. So last thing I'm going to show you is, I don't know if this is by design in integration services, but it's definitely something that you want to keep your eyes open for. Integration services 2012 and newer will allow you to have either a project level connection or a package level connection. And they really both behave the same way. The only difference is a package level connection is only visible in that package. A project level connection is visible to any package in that project, any and all packages in that project. Here's the little quirk that I found. So I've got a connection that I've named SSIS Gotchas. But as soon as I open this package up, I'm getting complaints that this can't find the connection manager that it's looking for. So it's looking for the connection ID starting with 3E49 and so on. Probably the same message here. Yep, so it's looking for that connection manager that it can't find. The connection manager is there. You can't tell that it's there because I'm going to rename this package level connection. I've got it named SSIS Gotchas. I'm going to put a 2 at the end of that, and in renaming that, I now have 2 connection managers in integration services. I didn't create a new one. This one, the SSIS Gotchas, had the same name as a project level connection, and if you have that, it's going to mask that project level connection. I really dislike that this is allowable in integration services code. I can't imagine any reason. I've seen a whole lot of ETL scenarios in doing ETL for 10 years. I can't imagine any ETL scenario in which you would want to have a project level connection with a package level connection of the same name. There just aren't any valid scenarios for that. However, integration services, the designer will allow you to do that. And if I change this from SSIS Gotchas 2 back to just SSIS Gotchas, it's not going to complain and say, hey, there's already a connection of that same name. It lets me rename that, and you can see we go now from 2 connections back to 1 visible connection because it's not showing me that project level connection because a package level connection of the same name exists. Now, once you know this is there, it's a really easy fix. You're simply going to rename that. So in this case, I've got my Gotchas 2. You always want to have your project connections named differently, but do be aware, this is one of those little time bombs, that if you happen to create a package level connection with the same name as a project level connection, it's not going to give you a warning or an error and prevent you from doing that. However, it will hide that project connection that you set up. And just to prove out that this is the way that works, I'm going to click on one more package. I've got a script that will actually go through, it'll loop through all the packages, all the connections that are available to a package. And when I do that, let me close out of these other two just to avoid, since Visual Studio's crashed on us, I want to avoid any sort of distraction there. So I've got a script task that will enumerate all the connections that we have. So I've got my SSIS gotchas. If I rename that to gotchas 2, now both of them appear. I'm going to run this script, and it's going to show me a pop-up window or a message box just to display all the connections that I have available. So I've got SSIS gotchas, 2, and then SSIS gotchas. However, if I stop that from running, I'm going to rename this back to the original name. Now I'll execute this. Now we're only going to see 1, and this is just the way that SSIS treats those connections. If there's a connection, a package level connection of the same name as a project level connection, it's going to mask that. Again, this is an easy fix. Name your connections distinctly. Make sure that you don't have any package connections that are named the same as project connections. But you do have to be aware that integration services will not prevent you from that name collision. And in almost every case, bad things will happen when you have that name collision. So those are just a few things that you have to look for when avoiding these type of time bombs in your integration services packages, from performance to data loss to logical errors, and even security as well. There are some things that you certainly want to pay attention to on your integration services packages. So we got a little bit of time left. Rob or Kenny, if you guys are on the line, we'll go ahead and take some questions if we've got any questions that are queued up.
Yeah, hey Tim. Can you hear me okay?
I got you, yes.
Okay, great. I'm just checking. No, I don't see any questions right now. Does anyone have questions? Type it in the question window, and I'll let Tim know. I do have a question. Are you going to be speaking at Summit?
I'm glad you asked. Yes, I will be speaking at Summit. So I'm doing a presentation on SSIS in the cloud and how the two can get along. So historically, integration services has been mostly looked at as an on-prem communication tool. However, there are several different ways that you can use integration services in the cloud, whether as a virtual machine, or just recently announced was the ability to run integration services as a platform as a service. And that's a brand new, I think it's still in preview, but it's brand new functionality that just last week it was announced at the Ignite conference.
Let's see. Well, we still don't have any questions, but what day are you speaking? Is it going to be on Tuesday or Wednesday, or?
I think it's Friday. Yeah, no, it's Friday.
Friday. So if y'all are at Summit, go check it out. I'm going to be there. Sounds like a great topic.
It should be fun.
Oh, here's one. Hi, Tim. Could you remind me of the case sensitivity server setting you mentioned in the previous demo?
Yeah, so on case sensitivity, if you're using full cache mode in the lookup transformation, it will always do a case-sensitive lookup if it's comparing alphanumeric data. So the thing that you have to do is you have to make sure that you're casting that, or you're changing that to either all uppercase or all lowercase data, both on the incoming data as well as the data that you're using for your lookup reference to do that comparison accurately. So unfortunately, there's not a native setting to tell it handle this with case, handle this irrespective to case. You actually have to go through the exercise of either upper or lower casing all that data to make sure that you're doing an apples to apples comparison.
Well, that's all we have question-wise. So, Tim, thank you for coming today. I really appreciate
my pleasure.
Your time and presenting today. I will send you a link, Tim, to the recording. And I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.